All right, let's dive into one of the most fascinating and honestly counterintuitive puzzles in climate science today. It's a real head-scratcher happening way up at 35,000 feet, and it could totally change the way we think about flying.
I know, that question sounds completely backwards, doesn't it? More fuel means more CO2 means more warming. That's Climate 101. But what if I told you the answer is maybe? Seriously, stick with me here, because the science behind this is pretty mind-blowing. You know, for decades, pretty much the entire conversation about flying and its impact on the planet has been about one thing and one thing only: carbon dioxide. It's always been seen as the long-term villain of the story, right? The gas that just hangs out in the atmosphere for centuries. Well, it turns out that by focusing only on CO2, we've been missing a huge piece of the puzzle. In fact, we've been missing most of it. Okay, check this out. This is where the story gets really, really interesting. The best climate science we have now shows that CO2 is only responsible for about a third of aviation's total warming impact. A third. The other two-thirds, they come from things you might not have even heard of. NOx emissions, that's nitrogen oxides, and contrails. Yep, those wispy white lines that planes sketch across the sky. So let's get our terms straight. Scientists call these non-CO2 effects. And here's the key thing. Unlike CO2, which lingers for ages, these effects are short-lived. A contrail might only last a few hours. But, and this is a big but, while they're around, they pack an incredibly powerful warming punch. And this is where our riddle really begins. Because it turns out that sometimes the very things you might do to reduce these powerful, short-term, non-CO2 effects can actually increase your long-term CO2 emissions. Let me give you a perfect real-world example. A pilot could tweak their flight path just a little bit to fly around a patch of cold, humid air. You know, the exact kind of air that creates those warming contrails. Great, right? But that little detour might mean burning, say, 1% more fuel. More fuel, more CO2. So what's the right move? And that question, that's been the massive challenge here. You're trading a short-term hit for a long-term problem. How do you even compare those? It's like asking someone, hey, would you rather have a really bad headache for a day or a mild stomachache for a week? They're just totally different things.
For years, climate science has been kind of stuck on this because the standard tools we use to measure climate impact, well, they just weren't built for this kind of specific, tricky trade-off.
And this quote from the source material just nails the problem. The main tool, something called global warming potential, or GWP, it breaks down. The warming from a contrail depends on where it is, the time of day, the season, the weather. You can't just slap a single number on it like you can for other gases. It just doesn't work. So what we desperately needed was a new tool, a way to finally put these completely different impacts on the same scale, so we could actually make a smart, informed decision about these trade-offs. And they came up with one. It's called Global Warming Per Activity, or GWA. Now, instead of trying to shoehorn everything into an equivalent amount of CO2, GWA takes a different approach. It just looks at the total warming energy, the heat, an activity adds to the planet over a period of time you choose. It's a much cleaner, much more direct comparison. So how does it actually work? Well, it's pretty simple in theory. First, you pick an activity, say all the flights that happened globally back in 2018. Then you measure all the warming energy that came from each source: the CO2, the NOx, the contrails, the whole shebang. And finally, you just add all that warming up over a set time period, whether it's 20 years, 100 years, whatever you're interested in. Now, this GWA metric is the engine, but it's what scientists built with that engine that is the real revolution here. They created a tool that takes all this messy, complex data and scientific uncertainty and turns it into something incredibly clear and useful.
It's called the Climate Trade-off Risk Curve, and you can basically think of it as a cheat sheet for making smart climate decisions for aviation. It tells you the actual probability, the odds, that making a certain trade-off will end up being a good thing for the climate.
Okay, so let's walk through this because it's really cool. This table is a simple version of what the curve shows for contrails, looking at 100 years. So if you're willing to burn that extra 1% of fuel, you need to cut contrail warming by at least 3% to have what scientists call a likely, or 67% chance, of this being a net win for the climate. Want to be even more sure? For a very likely, or 90% chance of success, you'd need to cut contrail warming by 5%. Suddenly, it's not a guess, it's a risk calculation. But, and this is maybe the most important piece of the entire puzzle, the right answer isn't set in stone. It completely changes depending on your goals. Specifically, whether you care more about warming that's happening right now in the short term or warming that's happening over the long term. Just look at this comparison. It's staggering. To get that 90% chance of success over 100 years, you need a pretty big reduction in those non-CO2 effects to make up for that 1% of extra fuel. But if you're focused on just the next 20 years, the whole picture flips. Because contrails and NOx have such a massive, immediate warming effect, you only need to reduce them by about 1.5% to make that trade-off a fantastic bet. The short-term benefit is huge.
So, what's the verdict? Let's boil it all down. First, we have a new tool, GWA, that lets us do a real apples-to-apples comparison of everything that contributes to aviation's warming. Second, that tool lets us build these risk curves that turn a fuzzy science problem into clear odds for policymakers. And the big takeaway? Going after these non-CO2 effects, even if it costs a little bit of extra fuel, is almost certainly a good bet for the climate. But the best bet? That all depends on whether we're playing the short game or the long game.
So look, this research doesn't give us one single magic answer. It's not a map with destination circled. What it is a compass. It's a powerful new compass that, for the first time, lets the aviation industry and policymakers navigate these incredibly complex climate trade-offs, not by guessing, but by truly understanding the risks involved.
Which leaves all of us with the final and maybe the most important question. The science is there. The tools have been built. The path forward, with all its probabilities and risks, is clearer than it has ever been. The question is no longer if we can make these smarter decisions, but will we? Now that we can calculate the risks, are we willing to make the trade-offs?